Hello, I'm Jake Stone.
I'm Jesse Owens.
We welcome you to another episode of Generally Particular, a production of the London Lyceum. Generally Particular is a show dedicated to discussing and reflecting on the whole Baptist story. We are a show by Baptists, about Baptists, and for Baptists, as well as Anglicans, Methodists, Presbyterians, Lutherans, and even Quakers and Lollards. I'm a Calvinist Baptist. Jesse is an Arminian Baptist. In the 17th and 18th centuries, we would have been known as a general Baptist and a particular Baptist. So we've brought those together in what we think is a fun way to form generally particular. Today's episode is a special one. In fact, we might say it's historical because it's the first time that Jesse and I are having a guest on. That's right. After doing 8 episodes, we've run out of things to talk about, so we needed someone else to come on. We are going to call these episodes, when we have people on, our Jawin episodes, as an homage to our Southern pride. For our first Jawin episode, we have Garrett Walden on. We are honored to have Garrett on. It's an honor because originally when we kind of thought about the idea of Generally Particular, Garrett was going to be a part of this, but he decided that Jesse and I were not Baptist enough for him, so he said he could only periodically come on once every 6 months. So, Jesse, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, man. You caught me off guard a little bit by inviting the Quakers and the Lollards in.
Hey, I'm just an ecumenical kind of guy.
Well, I think some of our folks might have some Lollard origins, but maybe that could be.
Is that where you're from?
Maybe that's where my people are from.
I think Garrett
comes
from a Quaker background, I believe.
Oh,
you think wrong.
I think that's why he prefers oatmeal over like Conecuh sausage and bacon and potatoes. Yeah. You can tell somebody about what is their breakfast food choice. If it's oatmeal or cereal, if it's pork and potatoes, there we go.
Wait, Garrett's an Alabama guy. He can't take oatmeal over Conecuh sausage.
I drove through Conecuh County just yesterday.
Did you stop there?
We stopped at a gas station across from a big Conecuh sausage.
Yeah, but you didn't go to the place.
I didn't go to the place.
Rest my case. All right. So we're glad to have you on, Garrett. And I think for most of our audience, they kind of know who Garrett is. But in case someone is listening who doesn't know who he is, Garrett, would you tell us briefly who you are and what you do and why you are the way that you are?
Well, I can try. So my name is Garrett Walden. I am a pastor of Grace Heritage Church in Auburn, Alabama. I'm from Alabama, born and raised. I did my undergraduate studies here at Auburn. Spent a little bit of time in Louisville, Kentucky, going to seminary. Moved back here, coming up on 7 years ago to be part of this church. And I've been a pastor at the church coming up on 4 years. So it's crazy how time has flown. I'm married. I've got 4 kids, and they are a ton of fun and a delight. And so another thing that kind of puts me in this conversation is I recently finished a THM in history and theology at Southern Seminary. I studied Baptist history with Dr. Michael Haken. And so that really was made a huge impression on me and has really given me a deep love for Baptist history, and especially some of the more uncharted territories in the Baptist story. So that's kind of a little bit about who I am and what I do. So I'm full-time as a pastor, and I kind of continue to research and write about Baptist history and theology kind of in the margins. I'm also one of the editors at the London Lyceum, and really grateful to be involved in that. So, Jake, there may be other things you might want to know, but you can go from there.
Well, 2 things. Number one, I'm just impressed that Garrett could give a little about himself, and he didn't say John Collett Ryland. I mean, I'm impressed. I was waiting for it to come out. Second of all, Garrett shared with some of us recently how he treats his children. He made his oldest son, Henry, throw the fish that he caught back into the water. And it made me relive a painful childhood memory when my dad made me do the same thing. Jesse, did you catch fish as a kid?
I did. I did. I don't know that I have as many painful memories as you do,
You probably didn't
but I
catch
did.
anything, did you?
No, no, I did. I've got some good
Oh,
pictures. Maybe we should bring those in for a slideshow on the next episode.
we have
I was
enough
thinking,
technical challenges as it is. We don't need to add PowerPoint.
yeah, we
Jesse,
can barely do this.
was your dad making you throw fish back around the same time he sent you to Catholic school?
No, he did not.
Listen, I was there just trying to share about the good old way. So
Yeah.
Hey, the first time I met Garrett was at Southern, probably around 2015, something like that. And he worked for the residential doctoral studies office. I don't know what his exact title was in there, but that was my first interaction with Garrett. He was probably involved in the fancy coffee making process that Dr. Pennington had going, but I remember him doing a great job.
Yeah, that was a part of my role at Southern when I was a student there. Was working in the office there, and I did make a lot of coffee for a lot of PhD students. Yeah, that was a really great time. Really, it was kind of in that role that really gave me an interest in kind of academic theology and just I guess thinking more deeply and trying to learn how to be a better communicator of God's word, but also just of kind of more academic, I guess, mediating some academic research into the life of the church. So that was a really important time for me. So I guess I forgot we would have met. So
Yeah. Well, I'm glad I made such a good impression on you, Garrett, that you forgot.
well, you know how it is when you work in the SBTS deep state. You
That's
kind of
true.
only remember the nobility, not the peasants.
That's true. That's right. I wasn't high enough
Yeah.
above Garrett's social status for him to remember
Jesse
me.
was a part of the Armenian quota that we have at Southern. So yeah.
I think I was the only part of the Armenian
Wow.
quota.
That means you're a very special person. That you're the one that was chosen. So so
I won't mention any names, but I was once asked, "So why are you here?" So, anyways,
don't worry, Jesse. I asked that about a few people around now. Okay. So let's learn some things from Garrett today. So first of all, Garrett, just kind of share with us what are some books you kind of mentioned earlier, maybe by name, professors that really have shaped you the most in kind of your pursuit of Baptist history.
yeah, good question. I will say it's come from
By the
books.
way, I
Also,
want to
in
make clear most of these questions came from Hunter Heinzman. I don't want to be accused of plagiarizing, so let me go ahead and give that shout out. All right, go ahead, Garrett.
very good. Yeah, this episode brought to you by Hunter Heinzman. Um, so yeah, books, but also personal conversations. So it was really an interest in church history more broadly, prompted by taking a class with Dr. Haken. I remember going into his church history one class with pretty much zero interest in church history, and I left that class with a deep interest in church history and really couldn't get enough of it. And so that kind of sparked that initial interest. It was mostly just seeing him, hearing him talk about church history with such passion and enthusiasm and seeing its relevance for the church. And then, that, of course, I'm reading books too. And so reading primary sources in Dr. Haken's classes, I think that's really a big part of what got me interested in church history. So specifically, I remember reading Basil the Great's On the Holy Spirit. I think I read it a few times during that Church History 1 class, and reading Augustine's Confessions. And there was a great kind of edited volume by a guy named Tim Dowley. I think it's called An Introduction to Christianity or something like that. And so those books really got me into the world of church history. And I was reading also Dr. Haken's book, Kiffin Knowles Keach. That book was really helpful and influential and kind of reeling me in. Dr. Nettles' 3 volumes on the Baptists really helped stimulate an interest in Baptist history. But then it was a phone call that I had with Dr. Haken once, where he was really encouraging me in doing some more advanced research and study in Baptist history. That was really the big thing that turned those gears for me. I was thinking about a PhD in patristics, and he was not discouraging that, but he basically just said, if you have the slightest interest in early Baptist history, you should really consider it. And he gave a handful of reasons, and one of those reasons was, if we don't do this work, no one else is going to, or they're going to do it poorly. So, like, would you really? He didn't say it this way, but this is how I kind of interpreted it. Would you really trust Presbyterians and Anglicans and Roman Catholics and Methodists to write Baptist history? Again, that's not exactly how he said it, but it's one of those things where, this is our history, and we have the most direct access to our tradition. We have the deepest interest in our own tradition, and we really ought to be doing this work, or else it's just not going to get done. And the further away we get from those primary sources, the more scarce they'll be, and we really need to prioritize this kind of recovery of Baptist history. And also, another piece of that was, for the early church fathers, it's kind of the, territory of Protestant scholars, including Baptists. It's the territory of Roman Catholic scholars, Eastern Orthodox scholars, secular scholars as well. There's just kind of I guess it's the common territory for a bunch of different groups, rightly or wrongly. But there's not really any competition for the territory of Baptist studies. It's pretty much, if Baptists aren't going to be interested in it, then probably no one's going to be interested in it, unless it's for some ulterior political purpose, perhaps. So those were two things that really drew me to Baptist history. I feel a deep sense of stewardship and responsibility for understanding our own history.
Garrett can't be taking shots at the Lutherans and the Methodists and the Presbyterians and the Anglicans so early. He's going to kill off at least one of our listeners.
Well, I was going to say there's a lot of Baptists I don't trust to tell our story either.
That's sadly true. Yeah.
So, Garrett, if someone's interested in pursuing Baptist studies, Baptist history, better understanding, where do you point them to?
Well, where I would like for them to go as soon as possible is primary sources. But I do think it's helpful to get a kind of a lay of the land. And so reading Nettle's 3 volumes on the Baptists, reading Haken's book that he co-authored with Nathan Finn and I think it's Anthony Shute, The Baptist Story. Those kinds of meta analyses of Baptist history would be really helpful just to get a lay of the land. But then I would say just find primary sources. And now a lot of that stuff's on Google Books. I was telling a friend just the other day about kind of a lesser-known Baptist leader in the 18th century, and I told him, hey, no one's really done much work on this guy. You could totally pick him up and run with him. And within 5 minutes, he was texting me saying, hey, I found this essay by this guy or this book on Google, and it's really, really interesting. And there's a lot of stuff out there if you just know where to look. There are databases that are specialized for those primary sources, but a lot of it's free on Google Books, and I just download the PDFs. A lot of times I'll print it off and just mark it up and just read and mark and take notes as I go. And as I find things that catch my interest, I'll look into secondary sources and textbooks and journal articles and see what has been said about this topic of this author, this book or essay, whatever it is, this sermon. And you'll be surprised. A lot of times there's just not a lot of secondary sources interacting with good primary sources. A lot of times what you find is secondary sources interacting with other secondary sources. And along the way, the primary sources get lost or misinterpreted or misrepresented. So I think there's a big need for Baptist historians and theologians to re-engage some of those early primary sources. They're not easily findable, like good editions on Amazon or something like that. So you'll have to go out and find them, but they're out there.
I do want people, though, to see the subtle differences in how we approach these subjects, because if you'll notice that as Garrett gave his answer, his first response wasn't what he should have said, which is that he points people to the Trail of Blood, which is the most comprehensive understanding of Baptist history. That's where you point people to first. Isn't that right, Jesse?
Well, I mean, all you got to do is pick up, Taylor and Crosby and all of those early Baptist historians and just look at the beginning of them and see what they do.
Yeah. Well, Garrett's more of a Bingham guy. That's how he approaches Baptist origins. So he's a Baptistic Congregationalist. So speaking of the Second London Confession, Garrett, I think you would say that you subscribe to it, correct?
Right.
Now, you don't
Right.
believe it's inerrant, though, do you?
I would not use the word inerrant for anything other than Scripture.
Okay, that's good.
But I think it's a faithful summation of the theology of the Bible.
Amen. So, with that in mind, let's think about now I will say this. So we're recording this the Thursday after the battle down there in New Orleans. I was told that I pronounced it a multitude of ways, and I'm just a creative kind of guy. And down there this week, I do think this is interesting. There was a motion made to amend the BFM 2000 about adding the terms overseer and bishop or something on the article on pastor. And I do agree that I agree with what the proposal was, but I do find it fascinating that there was no debate on amending the confession of faith. They just, kind of just voted and did that kind of fast. I do think that's kind of, somebody needs.
I thought that was a resolution. I think that's the resolution Tom Askell proposed.
No, there was the amendment, Jared Cornett, that made
okay.
and to change to amend the actual document. And I just find it surprising that happened that fast. I mean, I agree with what he was proposing, but anyway, I'm glad to see some people are saying next year they want to bring a motion about that they need to kind of articulate what that process should look like. So, y'all don't amend your confession, right, Jesse? The Free Will Baptist confession was given at Sinai, so there's no need to adjust it, right?
That's right. When it's perfect, there's no need.
We're all trying to catch up to y'all. So, So, with that in mind, Garrett, do you think that the Second London should in any way be revised or clarified? And what should that process look like if you were to amend a confession of faith?
I guess it would depend on how it's being used. So, like at my church, we adopted the Second London Confession when our church constituted about 20 years ago. We adopted it into our constitution and bylaws and said this is going to be the doctrinal standard by which our teaching and preaching will be accountable, and the congregation is going to hold our preaching and teaching accountable to the theology expressed in the confession. So here's my take on it. I don't think we should go amending the confession at all. I think what you can do is add, I guess, what would you call them, like supplemental.
Well, what about adding an additional chapter?
So I would say I would add that as maybe like an addendum or an appendix to your church's constitution and bylaws without modifying the actual words of the confession. So, for instance, if you wanted to add an appendix or an addendum to your church's constitution and bylaws, I don't think you go and say we're going to edit the confession. I think you say we're going to edit our constitution and bylaws to include this paragraph drafted by the elders or in conversation with other churches, ideally an association of churches who are helping guard the doctrine of the church. I think you could adopt some sort of supplemental thing that is relevant to whatever issue you think needs more precision given a certain context without editing or modifying the confession itself. So, for instance, I know churches that really like the Chicago Statement, and so instead of saying, "Hey, we're going to excise chapter 1 on Holy Scripture from the confession and put in its place the whole Chicago Statement," or something like that, don't do that. Just leave the confession as is, and also adopt the Chicago Statement if you think that you need that, or the Danvers Statement, or the Nashville Statement, or whatever other statement the statement on social justice and the gospel, whatever statement you want to adopt as well. I think it's better to just put that alongside it rather than go in there and tinker with the wording. We've had other churches consult our church about adopting the confession and wanting to modify the chapter on the Sabbath. And we have strongly advised against that because it's like a thread. If you pull this thread about the Sabbath, you're going to impact the chapter on the law, which is going to impact the whole kind of covenant theology of the confession. And I think you just really need to be careful when you go tinkering with the wording of the actual confession. I think there are better ways of specifying your doctrine for the times without, I guess, doing damage to the confession. That's my take. What do you think?
Yeah, I want to hear Jake's take. What's your take, Jake?
I think that's probably a better way of actually approaching it, because I do think that there are challenges that we face in 2023 that I don't think our forebears in the 17th century would have necessarily even thought about or comprehended. I do also understand that I think that's advisable also to take those documents and provide some way of modernizing English, but not losing theological concepts, but understanding that language does change. But I think that's a really probably the wiser way, instead of saying, we're going to take this part out, we're going to take that part out, and kind of approaching it from that standpoint. I think every church has a right to modify a confession of faith. I think it's more appropriate probably to do that in a network or an association of churches than on your own, because I think it's easy for you to have some kind of quirk or idiosyncrasy, and that kind of fuels how you change the document. I think it's much wiser if you do that with a body of counselors, which I think you find if you have churches together that may decide an association to modify a document like that.
Yeah,
I like the emphasis on association or denominational being the context for changing it. So thinking about First London to Second London, what was their approach? It kind of in line with what we're talking about here.
Yeah. So from my understanding, Second London was made by incorporating significant material from Westminster and Savoy, but also preserving some lines from the 1644. And so they're trying to do that in concert with other like-minded fellowships while preserving their own doctrinal distinctives. And I think that's a good thing. To do. So the 1689, the 1677, whatever you want to call it, the Second London Confession is not inerrant in the way that Scripture's inerrant, but it also is a product of its time. I mean, when you look at Jim Renahan's commentary on the Confession, I really like a lot of that book. It's really it's probably the best resource we have on the Confession. But a big part of his commentary are significant quotes from other contemporary sources like John Owen and Nehemiah Cox and others, where he's showing based on contemporary documents what they meant, and that influences how we ought to interpret the confession. I think he does a really good job of just kind of underlining the point that this is a very historically situated document. And you see that in, for instance, in lines like the way that they phrase the chapter on the Sabbath and the way that they talk about the Pope being the Antichrist and that sort of thing. I think if you try to understand it in its proper historical context, those things make a lot more sense and are a lot more agreeable. In terms of the Baptist Faith and Message 2000, it feels a little different because some of the people that drafted that were literally in the room, some of them speaking at the microphone. And so it feels a little bit easier, and there's more of a willingness to tinker with the wording there because you're not having to go back 400 years. You're really just going back 23 years. And that's not insignificant, but it's it doesn't feel as permanent as a significant historical document like the Second London Confession. But maybe that's just my intuition and not a good reason.
I'm sympathetic to what you're saying. I was just thinking, I wonder if you don't see a bit of amending it, certainly within those decades. Of course, it's within the lifetime of some of those same individuals, right? So there's something about it that would make it seem like that would be more feasible, like you were saying with BFM 2000 versus doing 400 years later. I do wonder about needing a commentary on a confession, especially Jake mentioned earlier with some of the language stuff. If that doesn't maybe say to us at least somewhat that maybe we need a confession that's based on, like you're getting with Savoy and Westminster, that's based on this confession or these confessions with some alterations for our modern setting, that isn't just sort of bringing forward, the 1689 or something like that. But I think that much of what you said is spot on. I'm not as hesitant about amending in the sense of kind of leaving everything as is, but I could certainly see some value in that. I did want to point out though that Jake was concerned about updating the English of the confession, especially considering his views on Bible translations. But maybe we could do that another time.
I'm a guy that understands that there is both the perfect and the imperfect. So I will say also that, in Baptist life, the first London and the second London, neither of those documents was just something that somebody sat down with a blank piece of paper and wrote. Both of those confessions were drawing from previous and earlier documents as well. So let's get now, and we want Garrett for you to try to keep this at a minimum. So, don't give us an hour lecture here. Anybody that follows you on Twitter, anybody that's ever heard you on podcast or just knows you, knows that some might think you're John Collett Ryland reincarnated. So you have a great love and affection for the man that told William Carey to shut up and sit down. So tell us, what has it been like to grow in your love and appreciation for someone who's been dead for over 2 centuries? And how has that affected how you love others today? It's a great question from Hunter Heinzman. I put my own spin on it.
Thank you, Hunter. Thank you, Hunter. So John Collett Ryland, born 1723, dies 1792. So this October will be his 300th birthday. So that's kind of crazy to think about. Maybe that's just me. Next month was the anniversary of his death. But so John Ryland is one of those Baptist figures that people don't really know much about. And if you know anything about him at all, it's probably something negative. Like Jake mentioned, he allegedly made that remark.
His son said he did it.
His son said he did not. His son said he wasn't even at that meeting. And so John Webster Morris went on and on about that. And then also the Marshmans, and then Eustace Carey. And so there's a whole bunch of conflicting information out there about what exactly John Ryland might or might not have said. But I accept it as probable that he made some comment that was really snarky and sarcastic to William Carey. The line goes, "Sit down, young man. When God pleases to convert the heathen, he'll do this without your help or mine." And so that's kind of the short version of what Ryland allegedly said to William Carey when William Carey suggests that the Great Commission applies to the church today or of his day. So
on this show, we call that rigid Calvinism.
So on that, John Collett Ryland is kind of portrayed as the rigid hyper-Calvinist. One of his,
that's really bad. A rigid hyper-Calvinist. I mean, not even just a normal hyper-Calvinist, a rigid one.
One historian called him the gruff hyper-Calvinist.
Jesse's going to add that into his arsenal now. Gruff, a new word.
I'm taking notes.
Well, anyway, I heard that comment about John Collett Ryland. And when you hear somebody say something like that about Ryland, your immediate thought is not, I want to know more about this guy. But it's really more, it's the opposite. It's like, wow, that guy sounds terrible. And so the way I heard about the name John Collett Ryland was on one of those phone calls with Dr. Haken. He mentioned his name just quickly in passing, and I didn't connect the dots about who that was in that comment. So my first real interaction with John Collett Ryland was reading his book. It's a 500-page book on the divinity of Christ. And I'm reading that book. I'm like, this is incredible. How come I've never heard of this person? How come this book has never been reprinted? Why is this person not a bigger deal? This is an absolutely incredible book defending the doctrine of the Trinity and Orthodox Christology. And it's just a absolute master class of biblical hermeneutics. And it's really just an amazing document. And then I later find out that he's the guy that allegedly said that to William Carey. And I'm just like, well, wait a minute. These things don't connect. There were sentences in that document on the divinity of Christ that directly contradict what he allegedly said to William Carey. And I didn't come with any notes for this. I'm just kind of freestyling here. So I have quotes from that book that are just like directly diametrically opposed to that sentiment said to William Carey. So that sent me down like what's going on here with Ryland's comment to William Carey, and what's going on with his alleged hyper Calvinism. Anyway, long story short, that just led me to a deep dive into everything I could find about Ryland. And the deeper I dove, the more, I guess, corridors opened. It's like if you're in a room and you open a door and it's like a hallway full of further doors, and you open another door and it's a hallway full of more doors. That's what I found with Ryland. The existing bibliography that I had at the time had like 12 titles on it. So I just started trying to track all those titles down. And I started compiling my own bibliography, and I ended up with over 121 titles attributed to John Ryland. And so he's just this prolific author. I do think he's been very misunderstood and misrepresented in the bulk of Baptist history. And so trying to understand him on his own terms, understand his personality based on the recollections and memoirs of his contemporaries, reading him in his own words rather than what the secondary sources say. I have found that secondary sources on Baptist history are not always very trustworthy. And if you don't read it for yourself in the primary sources, you need to look with some suspicion unless you know the historian really well. And so I just think that kind of primary source research has really enabled me to see things I couldn't have seen otherwise. So I basically feel a deep kinship with Ryland. I think I view him as a friend, as weird as that is to say. I think it's I view history and research and this sort of thing as an act of neighbor love. Part of loving your neighbor is to
neighbor love. Boy, if that's not a Gospel Coalition phrase, if I've ever heard one.
I'm not the one who's written for the ERLC, Jake.
They needed somebody to talk about Isaac Backus. I go wherever I'm asked. By the way, okay. let me just add a couple of things here real quick. Dr. Michael A.G. Aiken, in his great book on William Carey, Ryland said to Carey, "You are a most miserable enthusiast." All right, and then let's see. We also have here that Marshman, telling the story, said that he said all those things with a frown. I bet he had that frown like John Gill has in that portrait. It's probably kind of how it looked, I bet. So I love that one of the footnotes here attributes Ryland's remarks to ultra-Calvinistic theories. So Garrett said he felt a kinship. Well, you kind of got a gruff-looking beard going there, so I guess that makes sense. So.
It's the best I can do. So, like I said, on that interaction with Carey, there really are about 4 different descriptions of what that involved. And so I've got a couple of essays coming out at some point on kind of an assessment of the history of that event. And it really is quite interesting when you get down to it, what different people said he said. And they don't square up. And John Ryland Jr., his son, says, "My dad was not even at this event where this allegedly happened."
He's trying to take up for daddy. Well, you understand that.
Well, I mean,
we all get that.
They were co-pastors at the time in Northampton.
Oh, well, see, Dad was paying the salary. he had to defend him.
So, it was blood and money.
Yeah.
So I will say, part of, back to Hunter's question, learning to love a figure like Ryland. Some of the things that I've seen and looking at how other people talk about Ryland, who were his contemporaries, he was just a really kind of bizarre and eccentric person. He was kind of an explosive personality. He had a temper. He didn't always have great control of his tongue. And so a lot of times he would have these like just emotional outbursts that were sometimes so exaggerated that the authors and people writing these memoirs didn't feel comfortable to repeat the words in writing. And so he kind of had this bit of personality that made him very unpredictable and a bit volatile. But what's so interesting is when you read, for instance, John Rippon preached his funeral sermon at his death, and he basically says, all of his friends tried to help him to cover his faults. So rather than like pouncing on him whenever he said something off color or kind of not in his best state of mind, his friends would really try to come behind him and point out his faults, and also go to others who may have heard him say something and say, he didn't really mean it that way. That kind of came out wrong. So I really admire his contemporaries' awareness of his weakness, his own personal weakness, and their efforts to conceal that, not as like a cover up, but as a way of helping to preserve his good name and reputation. And I think in a godly way. There's ways to explain that make it sound sketchy, but I don't think it's that way. So I feel like now as a historian, I'm joining in those efforts with his contemporaries of trying to just put his words and his outbursts in context. And I think that's really important for us to think about as we read about figures in our history, of just saying, like, I don't just need to like look for quotes from them that are tweetable and like little one-liners. I want to understand the person. I want to understand the time. I want to understand their church situation and their cultural situation, really, really build knowledge from there rather than just looking for things that might be easily shareable in our social media world.
Well, I can tell you this, Jesse's had to do that the same for me, to explain some of the things that I've said and try to help him. I think a few times he's attributed to the coffee that I drink. So,
yeah,
since
I don't call it coffee, and part of it is sending Jordan Stefaniak messages and saying, "Can you please edit the episode before it posts online, and take out this section of Jake saying this or that." So I do commend what you're saying, Garrett. I think kind of what you're saying is giving a sympathetic reading of the text and trying to consider things in their age, in their context, in their setting, and realizing that sometimes there are on these historical figures, like there are people in our own day, maybe some rough edges, or maybe they said things in ways that they didn't intend, or maybe they're taken the wrong way. But the goal is not to give those just to give sound bites, but is to have an actual understanding of those historical figures.
Yeah. I will say one of the hard things for me is because I have that sympathetic posture toward Ryland, I need to constantly check myself that I'm not reading him through rose-colored glasses. Because there are times where he says things that just make no sense and directly contradict something he says elsewhere. And one of the things I need to continually kind of check myself on is, am I trying to make him into something that he wasn't? Because his contemporaries, they really did say that he was a bit of a volatile person and spoke things that were not great and certainly not repeatable. And there's a whole series of letters between John Newton, the hymn writer, and John Ryland Jr., where John Ryland Jr. is basically asking Newton for advice. My father has said this and he's done this, and I really think I should publicly say something. And John Newton basically says, you should quit the town before you denounce your father in public. And so, John Ryland Jr. was at great pains to try to figure out how to manage accounting for his father's misspeaking and missteps while still showing honor. And thankfully, John Newton was a wise older father figure to Ryland Jr. to help him try to figure that out. So I need to make sure that I account for that in my own thinking about Ryland. But anyway, at the end of the day, I think there's just a lot of a deep need to try to understand people in their own terms by reading primary sources.
Yeah. So we're going to ask you a series of questions in just a bit for fun, but I'm going to go ahead and jump to one because what I had before you said anything about John Newton here was, did John Collett Ryland and John Newton have the same barber? That was one of my questions. And for anyone who's listening to this, you need to Google John Collett Ryland and John Newton, and you'll realize they must have had the same barber.
No, they wore the same
So-
wig.
So here's, they knew each other well. John Newton and John Ryland.
So this is like a who wore it better then.
It really is. They knew
Probably
each other
John
really
Newton.
well.
He was the Anglican. He would have had more money.
So
Nicer wig.
Yeah.
when John Ryland in the 1750s was in Warwick, John Newton came to Warwick and became a pastor for a brief time at an independent church there before he went into the Anglican church. And so they knew each other in Warwick in the 50s, and then Newton went to Olney, and Ryland went to Northampton, and they remained in close contact, and that's how Ryland Jr. became such good friends with John Newton. So it wouldn't surprise me if they actually did. They lived in the same town for a time. They really may have had the same barber.
All right. So this is Garrett's the first person who's ever going to get this treatment, and so this will be a part of our kind of deal we'll do when we have guests. We're not calling it rapid fire because we're not charismatics. We're Baptists, so we're calling it rapid dunk questions. So we're going to get started here. Question number, we've already asked the first one in a sense. All right. Garrett, have you ever edited the Wikipedia page for John Collett Ryland?
I never have. I should.
All right. No, because then you'll take out what his statement he made to Carrie that we know happened. All right. Manuscript or outline when you preach?
Full manuscript every time.
Footnotes or endnotes?
There's only one right answer to this.
Yeah.
G2 gel pens or fountain pens?
The Pilot G2.
Garrett is
every time.
Garrett is a man of the people.
Hey, I hope Dr. Haken doesn't watch this.
English Baptist or American Baptist?
Ad Fontes, brother. English Baptists.
Moving along. New Hampshire or Second London?
The Second London, of course.
The KJB or a perversion?
Given those options, the KJB, I like it just fine.
Kiffin or Bunyan?
Kiffin.
Lumpkin or Macbeth?
Oh.
I would say Lumpkin because he did that volume on the Confessions.
At least you have the Confessions there.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, Macbeth has much more of his commentary and editorial thoughts in his volume. All right, here we go now. Gill or Ryland Sr.?
Depending on the nature of what we're talking, I mean, you got to go John Gill. I mean, he's got the whole systematic, and they got the commentary. In terms of who I like to read more, Ryland. But if I could only have one of their complete works, it would be Gill.
That's because Gill wouldn't have told Carrie to sit down. He would have thrown Carrie out of the meeting. All right.
Well, so
I got to say, I commend Garrett for this. He has taken on demonstrating that John Gill is not a hyper Calvinist, and that Ryland Sr. didn't say whatever he said to William Carey. He's really taken.
He's really good. The Trump legal team should hire him. He does a great job.
So I want to come back to the.
No, we got to move through these. My computer's about to die. So
keep going.
All right, Keach or Marlowe?
Benjamin Keach, though Marlowe does say one of my favorite insults. He accused his interlocutors of being a coterie of book-burning papists, and I use that insult quite often. So, but yeah, Keach.
All right. Boyce or Broadus?
Boyce.
Carver or Dale Moody?
Probably Carver.
Okay. Convention or association?
Association.
Bacchus or Leland?
Bacchus.
Walmart or Kroger?
Walmart.
Should we count Roger Williams as a Baptist?
Briefly.
All right. And then the most important question. Since you are from Auburn and Auburn is known for trashing their campus, which do you prefer when you TP your campus, Charmin or Quilted Northern?
Probably Charmin.
Okay.
They supply all that out there.
Okay. Yeah. I love to think about all of the probably environmentalists down there who celebrate trashing trees. Fascinating to me.
We love it. Can't get enough of it.
Well, it doesn't happen very often for y'all, so I guess it is a historic moment when it does.
It's been a rough few years, I will say.
Well, Jesse, how did he do on the rapid dunk questions?
I think he did really well. Some of those were difficult questions.
We had a few that we wanted to, but we'll leave those for unrecorded answers.
That's for the bonus episode.
And you got to get more than $5 for that one. So, Garrett, we appreciate you coming on and chewing the fat with us a little bit here at the Generally Particular. Is there any last thoughts?
It's been a joy to draw with y'all.
Is there any last thoughts that you would like to share with us?
Just everybody stay Baptist.
Amen. Stay Baptist, my friends. You've been listening to Generally Particular. This week, the Three Amigos. Tune in to us for the next episode.